When you talk about Project Moon, chances are one of the first point of interest you'll probably mention to a newcomer is the brilliant world building that it has. And an even bigger chance that you're specifically talking about the one presiding in a dystopian capitalist hellscape of the city, a place that is essentially divided into multiple different sectors, with each sector then further divided into two zones, with the more prosperous half being ruled by massive corporate entities known as the Wings, and the other more unfortunate half being unofficially ruled by these massive crime syndicates called the Fingers, whose rule and grip over their backstreets has been rumored to rival those of even the Wings in power. And as we inevitably draw closer and closer to the end of the season, which coincidentally enough revolved around the Five Fingers, I thought this will be a fun topic to discuss as its own separate video, especially since their relevance to the plot only seems to be growing bigger and bigger ever since the latest cantos. Now, obviously each finger is very distinct from one another, each embedded with their own culture and traditions. And just to clarify, the purpose of this video isn't to give you an objective ranking of each of the fingers, rather one that is completely subjective and based on my personal opinions. Oh, and if you were to ask me what were the criteria used to judge each of the rankings, I would say it's how much relevance they have in contributing to the plot progression overall. And a small bonus if I think their culture stands out a lot, or is at least very distinct compared to the others. So without further delay, let's start from the very bottom. In the violent world of the city, you can expect something as horrifying as bloodshed and mutilation to be a trivial part of your daily life. Yet for some groups of people, this grotesque display of violence isn't necessarily viewed in disgust/fear, but rather considered as something more akin to a display of art. I'm not gonna lie, before the release of the 2013 Intervalo, I would have said The Ring, whilst being interesting on its own, is also ironically still the least interesting of the Five Fingers. They just didn't have the same impact or leave an everlasting impression whenever you would encounter them in the story. But after playing the Intervalo, I'm starting to see the appeal of The Ring. For a quick recap, The Ring is basically further divided into a few subsections, each of course majoring in different forms of what they consider art, such as the Pointillist, who is probably the most famous of the bunch, and the group that is most well known to wield the comically large paintbrushes. Then there's the, in my opinion, two more interesting specialists that makes up The Ring. There are the Corporists, which is the section that specializes in finding/creating art out of the relationship between the human bones and muscles, which oftentimes resulting in their galleries being filled with jumbled mess of unsolved horrors that was probably once regular people living their day-to-day lives in the backstreets. Then there's, as of the writing of this video, the latest subsection we've been introduced to, which are the Evolvists, and one that I think is the most interesting one out of the bunch, since they focus on creating these artworks derived from the body parts of various monsters/animals, which are all then meticulously attached together, resulting in the creation of new creatures that they themselves deem as their art, which I'm guessing the tougher the materials are to get the better piece it produces. I mean, the eye of a second kindred blood fiend does fit in that criteria, right? These body parts also act as a sort of weapon, whether it be primary or secondary, to help in their battles. Of course, like all the others, the Ring also has its own hierarchical system that it applies to every single one of its members, regardless of the specific section they belong to. There are the aspiring students, of course making up the majority of the population within the Ring, the Docent, which makes up the middle rank, and finally the Maestro, a rank reserved for only the most prominent/distinguished members of the Ring, and also one that commands nigh absolute power, authority, and influence in the finger itself. There might be further higher ranks ascending from the Maestro, but as of the writing of this video, these are the only rankings that have been officially mentioned in this story. So yeah, overall I do really like The Ring. If nothing else, I really do appreciate how convinced the followers of The Ring themselves are that the multitudes of different brutalities that they're doing is justified in the sense that they view it as their own art pieces, rather than it being an all-out act of crime, since if we're being fully honest here, who's gonna stop them anyways? But moving onward from The Ring, we arrive at not only the latest to be introduced of the Five Fingers, but also one that we probably know the least of so far, and that is the Pinky. Now, we all know the city isn't necessarily a stranger to introducing and housing secret organizations spread throughout its various districts and nests, all scrambling towards the same one goal that frankly is also the reason why their group is established in the first place. Yet what makes the Pinky so interesting by comparison is, 1. Its secrecy that extends even beyond most other secret organizations we know of, who usually has a clear objective established, and by contrast, each seat holder of the Pinky has their own individual goals, rather than a collective collective one. And 2 is that each of their members sometimes frankly don't even know of each other's existence. Heck, we know some members of the Pinky who frankly works as a double agent of sorts for the other fingers. And speaking of, their hierarchical system is also pretty interesting to say the least, since they don't really follow the conventional ranking system of the other 4 fingers, instead establishing 108 separate and unique individual rankings for each seat holder, to which the name of each seat holder is also a direct reference to the famous 14th century Chinese novel titled Water Margin, which also helps explain their overall seemingly wuxia-inspired aesthetic, and the fact that they only have 108 individual titles/seats also heavily implies that each member of the Pinky possesses skill/knowledge far surpassing that of other finger members, which usually works more as a collective and possibly vastly outnumbers the Pinky in direct quantity. Aside from that, I don't really have much more to add regarding them, since as I've said previously, the general outline of how their society works is all we generally know of thus far, and frankly, the only reason I put it at 4th rather than last is because of how unique the Pinky is, and the basically direct confirmation from Project Moon itself about the massive role it'll most definitely play in the future. But yeah, as for now, they remain an organization that moves out of sight and in the background, a polar opposite to the next group on the list. The middle, the finger most known for its bravado, camaraderie, and most important of all, their strange taste in hairstyles. But don't let them ever find out you said that, because one other thing that they're apparently famous for is serving extreme violence. I mean justice through extreme violence. You see, in the middle, respect is everything, whether it be respect stemming from outside the finger or even within it. Speaking of, their hierarchical system, much like every other finger besides the Pinky, is also broken down into several tiers, ascending from the little sibling to the big sibling and peaking at the great sibling. And again, much like with the ring before, it is presumed that there are higher/greater ranks beyond it, but not that we know of so far. Now, having said that, where the middle itself might differ is in their attitude towards those rankings. As in, whilst it might seem more of an official status thing, it is also in a sense an actual bond/kinship that they have. Whilst yes, the culture in the finger itself typically pushes for the respect for higher-ups much like every other finger, it is also more so seen as just that. Their presumably rigid culture, and probably done to just avoid members who misbehaves and causes misdemeanors in the first place. Speaking of misdemeanors, if you, as an average law-abiding citizen, ever so happens to unfortunately cause one against a member of the middle, you would unfortunately probably find your name amongst possibly countless others listed in their special book, aptly titled the Book of Vengeance. Though of course, the severity of your crime also contributes to how severe the punishment is going to be lashed out in return. Also, if you think you can for some reason just run away from this fact, mind you that it is proven and evident that they will literally catch you no matter if you're in the middle of the literal ocean or if you're in a whole other district that also operates under completely different laws and whose backstreets usually is under the rule of a complete other finger. So in the end, whilst I did place the middle in, well, the middle, I really do think from a technical standpoint and just looking at cost benefits that it is probably the best finger to join, or at the very least, if you are indeed just an upstart, upcoming and promising syndicate that wanted to make it big but need the protection of a bigger organization, which usually translates to a protection from a finger, well then becoming a subsidiary of the middle is probably one of the better choices. But most important of all is that they're the syndicate that knows how to have the most fun, and most of the time are pretty easygoing in nature, a complete and polar opposite to our next contestant. Now if the middle were all those qualities I previously described, then the same could be said of the thumb, except they take it to even more extremes, and they're Italian. The first noticeable quality that you'll probably notice present in most members of the thumb is their demeanor, where from what we have been shown so far, they seem to take a much more stern approach to their missions, and this seems to be the usual attitude they have not only in fulfilling their jobs, but also regarding their adherence to the hierarchy, the rankings of which are tiered all the way from Soldato Kapo, which makes up the lowest and most common foot soldiers, Kapo which then commands over a group of soldatos and is largely rumored to be on par with the average associate fixer. Then we have the Consigliere, which I'm not really certain if this is an actual official rank fitted in with the rest, or if it's more of a quote-unquote special position pertaining more to the role of advisor to certain higher-up. But anyways, we then finally move up to the Sato Kapo slash underboss, which not only holds power and rules over huge swaths of the syndicate, but is also the highest tier of rank whose power we have been privileged to see thus far, and is also the direct underling to the honorable and highest tier position of Capo dei Capi slash Godfather, and whose ranking is a complete and utter mystery, since it hasn't even been confirmed if it is indeed a position that is only held by one particular individual or multiple at the same time. By the way, you'll be happy to know that I wasn't completely exaggerating when I previously said that their adherence to the hierarchy goes beyond extremism, since one of the main rules that they've established makes it so that you can't even face your direct superior face to face without it being seen as a form of disrespect. And unlike the middle, which is more collective in their view of this particular hierarchy, the thumb by contrast seems to be much more individualist, as in they seem to apply this worldview that they have to individuals even outside the immediate vicinity of the finger itself. One solid case for this would be back in Ruina, when Kahlo told one of his Capo underling Catriel of the mistake she had unintentionally made for disrespecting Angela, who he himself surmises to send at a higher echelon than an underboss like himself just by being the head of a star of the city. And upon realizing the mistake she had made, immediately without any hesitation, she told one of her other Capo companion Dennis to help her cut off her own tongue as a sort of compensation for the mistake she had made, which pretty much just cements my beliefs that this mentality is practically ingrained in every single individual inside the thumb, regardless of the many different divisions they have. And speaking of divisions, wherein whilst they are divided into geographically different locations, much like the other fingers, they are also branched out even further into different families. And whilst I'm not 100% certain how these different families operate exactly, and whether the different subsidiaries such as the Kurokumo are also counted as something akin to a different family, one thing we do know is that they seem to be viewed in the same category as different branches of the main finger itself, as in they seem to have a pretty similar role as the previously mentioned different schools of the ring does. All in all, this just showcases how fleshed out the thumb are by comparison to some of the other fingers, which I mean makes sense considering the massive head start they had by debuting earlier in the timeline, which probably also helped with garnering our interest in the way their society works in the first place, as well as the massive role they had in shaping the more recent cantos, which all then probably accumulated into the reason I had for placing them second on the list. And that's not even taking into account the potential they could possibly have from here on out, whether it be a major one in shaping the overall geopolitics inside the city itself, which genuinely speaking is probably the more realistic outcome, considering not only the overall size of their syndicate, their recent involvements in the plot itself, but also the fact that they just seem to generally have the budget to back my statement off. Yet on the other end of the spectrum, I could also see them taking a more background role in the near future, due to the fact that they have participated and have been given so much spotlight as of recently, thus letting the other less developed groups like the Pinky maybe in turn finally get their own deserving spotlight time, especially since unlike most of the other fingers, their story is tied specifically to the literal fate of the city itself. Which then finally brings us to my and probably a lot of people's personal top pick for this ranking, the Index. First of all, what do I even need to say about this particular group? Plot relevance? Check. Great concept? Check. Cool aesthetic? Check. There is nothing one could discuss about the Index without stating numerous positives about it before even coming close to stating the first bad one. Let's start the discussion with arguably the most important concept. Their whole gimmick, if one could even describe it as that, is the idea of existing to follow and execute a certain command given/distributed to them using various physical devices, the most common of which being the paper slips, which would then be upgraded to more, I guess, convenient tools such as a small pager as you move through the ranks. Now, these prescripts which the so-called followers of the Index receives can range from something simple/mundane such as wave your hand at an intersection to something slightly more absurd like if the first person you meet outside today answers your greeting by lifting their right hand, take their heart out. If the person ignores your greetings instead, remove your own heart from your body. Mind you, the prescripts that the followers do receive are considered to be a phenomenon or an absolute, as in they're something more akin to a force of nature that you absolutely must execute if you're in any way part of or an extension of the Index itself. to which the consequences if you do fail to execute the prescripts given to you is severe, to say the least. Which also means, going back to the example of the previous prescript I just gave you, if for some reason you were extremely unlucky and the person just so happens to ignore your greeting, well, they're essentially just telling you to choose
the method of your own death.
And speaking about the prescripts, one of the many great mysteries for a lot of people residing in the city who have had the unfortunate opportunity to directly or indirectly encounter the index would be regarding the origin of its creation, as in who would be responsible for issuing out the seemingly random/bizarre commands that for the most part also acts as a sort of guiding figure that this entire cult-like group is pretty much built around. But obviously, we the players seeing it all from a perspective outside the story knows that the prescripts basically comes from a small thing called the will of the city, which, to put it at an extremely simple term, is essentially what the various denizens of the city believe to be an all-encompassing force that dictates every ongoing sense of the city. Every desire, thought, destiny, and culture is practically and essentially linked and further expands the metaphysical force that is the will of the city. And it's also pretty much the basic guiding principles that makes up the entire identity of the index, wherein their main role in all of this is to act as a sort of middleman syndicate in conveying what they believe to be messages from the so-called will of the city itself. Now, getting into the rank/hierarchy of the index would be a pretty hard topic to discuss, since much like the Pinky, they don't really have a hierarchy in a traditional sense, since it's more so broken down into several different roles. But they do have a sort of initiate position, which is placed into the very bottom, named the proselytes. And this is essentially the only hierarchical position in the entire syndicate, as in they're placed at the bottom of the totem pole, and their main role, as you can imagine, is to simply just execute the prescripts, no questions asked. And one very cool symbolism regarding these guys is their choice of fashion, since if you didn't notice, you usually see their eyes hidden from sight under the cover of a blindfold. And this also represents their sort of allegiance to the index by essentially saying they won't need to use their vision to see the path before them, rather pledging their full trust in the guidance of the prescripts itself. Now, this is where I said it gets kinda weird, since there's not necessarily a next rank projecting upward from the proselytes. Rather, it's branched out into several different roles that are all, I'd say, of equal value/rank, starting from the proxy, which usually takes up the mantle of an enforcer of sorts towards the previously mentioned proselytes, mainly driving punishment towards those who fail to execute the prescripts given to them. The messenger, which are basically, as the title pretty much explains, is the distributor of the prescripts that have been written out usually in the more classic form of the paper slips. Interestingly enough, the messenger themselves, from what we've been shown so far, are actually also left in the dark regarding the origins of their prescripts itself, which leads us to our next role, the Weaver. Now, this one is a pretty unique position, since their job is essentially to tend to one of the most sacred items belonging to the index as a whole, and that is the loom, which in short is essentially one of the two main known methods used to decrypt the messages into feasible writings that is then delivered to the respective followers of the index. And interestingly enough, the Weavers themselves don't exactly know how many of them there are in the city, which just further recontextualizes how secretive the index are, even compared to some of the other fingers. Now, the last rank that has only been recently introduced is the Oracle's proxy, and their role is, on a grand scale of things, pretty much almost exactly similar to the ordinary proxies, with the tiny difference of, instead of them receiving their prescripts from the formerly mentioned messengers, who in turn receive theirs from the Weavers and the Loom, they receive it directly on a small device from the so-called guards of the city, which are entities whose identity as of currently are still shrouded in complete mystery, as the only one that has been mentioned thus far is Hermes, who in Greek mythology represents the god of speed, and as well as the messenger of the gods themselves. But more information regarding them, I imagine, would probably be revealed in a certain someone's canto in the near future. All in all, what I really like about the way PM has handled regarding the development of the index thus far is in their connection to the greater inner workings of the city itself, as well as the term will of the city, which, as we've established, is the main ideology that surrounds the index, has only been mentioned in Ruina and onwards. The definition was also somewhat loosely conveyed all the way back in the first game and coined as the disease of the mind, and pretty much describes the exact same thing, which of course is a very roundabout way of describing the bane of hypercapitalism, which is obviously what the Project Moon games are all about in the first place. And that's pretty much it. Overall, I've just really enjoyed how much of an influx of sudden screen time they have given to the fingers, especially in the more recent stories, which is good since obviously, as I've said, they represent the latter more unfortunate half of the city, yet the majority of the story that PM does tell usually revolves more on lives in the more urban parts of the city, which are obviously the nests. So this in turn is just an appreciated change of pace in my book. And I don't think this needs to be said, but I'm definitely excited to see more of them in the near future. So yeah, I don't really have anything else to add regarding this topic. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry if this video came out a little later than usual, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.